We have the pleasure of having Greg Collins with us today. Professor Collins I've been with him for 5 years when I was a PhD student at Arizona State University. Amazing man, lots of accomplishments, has been in China for more than 20 years, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Has been responsible for setting up supply chains in China when things were not as clear. And he's been involved with Xbox. He has lots of beautiful stories which you can connect to him offline and hear. One thing that you may not know, and we could have a separate webinar for that, is I'm sure a lot of us would be interested in webinar on that topic, is Professor Collins is a certified rattlesnake handler. And all those who from Southwest Florida, rattlesnakes is to Phoenix what alligators is to us here. So that's something we can relate to. But I will hand it over to him to let him introduce the topic and then take us through his presentation. Professor Collins.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shah, and thank you so much for Florida Gulf Coast University, Luke Burke College of Business. My honor to be here today. Always love to support you, Dr. Shah, and your supply chain ecosystem there, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. It will be relatively brief, and I look forward to any conversation that we can have in our short period of time or afterward as well. A little bit about me. I'm on the faculty at Arizona State University, the W.P. Carey School of Business in Department of Supply Chain Management. Previous to this, I've spent 20 years in China as an executive at Microsoft, Flextronics, now known as Flex, and Gerber Scientific. And in 2006, I started the Lakeline Group to work with private equity investment banks interested in acquisitions of low-cost supply chains for Western companies. So let us jump right into it. I will share my screen. Dr. Shah, is that okay?
Yep, please.
Okay, it says it's disabled screen share.
It's enabled. Can you try again?
Yeah, here we go. Okay, excellent. Can we bring back manufacturing from China? Boy, is this a conversation that all of us are having throughout industry and throughout much of the country and the world. So today I'd like to address typically the supply chain related issues of bringing back manufacturing from China. As I'd mentioned, I spent a lot of my career bringing companies to China and building supply chains in China. And now over the last few years, there is much more of an interest in the regionalization of supply chains. And not to mention, we're right in the middle of COVID. So there's much here for us to discuss. So let's start a little bit with what we know. From the trade imbalance with US and China has been many years in the making. And if we think about what are our top exports from China that we import into the United States: cell phones, household goods, computers, computer accessories. A full 30% of those are electronics. Many are worker-paced processes and high economies of scale manufacturing in China. And note, compare that to apparel, which is about $90 billion in 2021. When we think about what those top imports that we bring in from China, many of those are from contract manufacturing or EMS, electronic manufacturing services companies that are manufacturing and assembling the products from China. That becomes very relevant for us as we think back, as we start thinking about how do we bring back manufacturing from China. So made in China. I often ask my students, how is it possible that Apple, a company in the United States, which is 4.2 roughly % of the world population, can produce greater than 250 million mobile phones today for shipment around the world? we never think about the million employees in that ecosystem with very highly efficient ecosystem with Apple. We don't even think that we can't see in the United States a factory with 20,000 workers working in a factory, which is not considered big in China. So when we think about made in China, we're talking about really two issues or two areas really of integrated and now mature supply chains. The Yangtze River Delta, which is the Shanghai ecosystem from say Shanghai up to Nanjing. That area is 20% of the GDP of China. It is highly integrated supply chain infrastructure. 25 years ago, when we were bringing manufacturing to China, we were importing all of those components from the US or elsewhere to assemble into final product and then re-export from those. The Pearl River Delta is the oldest and the first experiment in China that is now the manufacturing center for everything that we buy, everything in your garage, your bathroom, your kitchen. And that is the electronics, computers, accessories, home goods, toys, apparel. These are massive integrated supply chains that today we just would never see in the United States. So our global growth of many of our brands in the US are because of this massive supply chain that we don't even see today in the US. So when we think about, I use this term descaling of China. And as it's a topic that has been with us now for a few years, it actually has been happening since the 2010s. I was actually at Foxconn in 2010 when there were 15 worker suicides. Nets were placed up around the buildings, the tops of buildings and in the stairwells. And that was the rise of the working and living conditions in China and the new supplier code of conduct. This changed much of what happened in the supply chain in China. What we didn't see from a US perspective was there was a de-aggregating already going on with factories. The factory at Foxconn, that was Foxconn City, had 350,000 workers and was bringing in 50,000 workers a month to mitigate the turnover in workers. And primary to that time, these converging factors that led to this was the availability of low-cost mobile phones. Most of the workers working in places like Shenzhen or working in the computer industry or apparel industry come from very different backgrounds further west in China. Many of them are rural, and many of them come to work and live in dormitories in these regions. And all of a sudden, in 2010, the availability of low-cost mobile phones allowed people to access WeChat. They could get information. They could learn if a factory across the street was giving 10% more wages, and then in mass, you'd have people moving from factory to factory. Well, China itself had seen these factors coming into play, and that social insurance law in 2011, we say the Wu Xian Yi Jing in Chinese, is that becomes the burdened wage. And in some cities, it's greater than 40%, which was a rapid increase in the labor cost in China. Not to mention, further things happened in the 2010s, was the Japan earthquake and tsunami, Fukushima. This caused great turbulence in the automotive industry, for example, of single-sourced components that were built in Japan. So people started to think about the regionalization of a supply chain, or sometimes we think about today, a common term we use in the supply chain is resilience. How do we build a resilience? How do we build a model for redundancy and resilience that doesn't raise our costs exorbitantly? So the 2010s was really the era of what I call the wake-up call, and also the emergence of Vietnam. After that 2010, 2011, early in the 2010s, we started to see many companies starting to add a China plus one type of supply chain strategy, where they would move final assembly, largely labor-based, into Vietnam to start accessing lower cost labor because China was starting to rise, as well as to create less risk within that supply chain. But there are other supply chain strategies we talk about today, region for region. And that's what we're talking about, the regionalization of supply chain. If we think in our minds what it would look like if that million employees at Apple was separated between North America, Europe, and Asia, what that would look like for the kinds of talent that we would need in companies. And Vietnam offered an easier and a quicker way to move into a second source outside of China to access the lower labor costs and to reduce the risk. But it wasn't just Vietnam. It's Malaysia. It is Thailand. It is, and in recent years, it's starting to run into to India, where Apple has now begun doing mobile phone manufacturing in India as well. So what did we learn pre-COVID?
Mortgages or any debt on it at all?
I'm sorry? So what did we learn pre-COVID? With the China Plus One, we learned it's lowest friction and it's less risk. Culturally, it's something similar to China when we look at it from 30,000 feet. When you look at it much closer, it's very different. But the speed to volume, the pull from China, the eagerness of Vietnam to build employment opportunities for the country was of massive significance. But what happened with that supply chain is that they're importing raw materials from Asian low-cost countries for final assembly. So we're adding lead time when we do a China Plus One, plus potential import duties of materials. We also realized in recent years, places like Vietnam, they can be overwhelmed. Vietnam has only 100 million population in the country compared to China's 1.4 billion people. There's a limit to how much scale and scope that a Vietnam or a Thailand or a Malaysia can actually absorb of the massive supply chain and the economies of scale that are in China. As well, what we learned also is that there's a lot of the ex-China availability for high volume deep water port capacity is limited outside of China in Asia. It's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that China has massive supply of port capacity in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, in Ningbo. And for the region-to-region manufacturing, and some of the interest that we have in the US is, and we hear much in the news of nearshoring and reshoring from China to Mexico or the US. And this again has been going on for quite some time. The average burden labor cost in Mexico had become lower than China by 2014. So today we look at about an average a wage in Mexico, 4.82 US dollars to China's 6.5. And again, that's the burdened wage with the social insurance that is not an insignificant factor in the cost of China. And what we also learned is China manufacturers of functional products have massive efficiency already at scale. It's a very difficult decision when you have such high efficiency, high economies of scale, and an supply infrastructure that to de-aggregate that, to move to another country is a very difficult decision, because ramping something up in another country, bringing up new talent, bringing up a whole supply chain infrastructure takes tremendous amount of years to make happen. That's nothing that can happen so efficiently, very easily. We also learned in this region for region, the US and Mexico, the scale availability and capacity of key talent, tooling, a significant aspect, and sourcing. We have limited amount of populations in the US and Mexico, as well as the ecosystems that still understand how to pull together a supply chain to grow talent. Are we graduating the engineers that we need? We don't have in the US, we don't have the apprenticeship programs like you see in Germany or in Japan, where in Japan, if you want to work for Grand Seiko, luxury watch manufacturer, it takes 10 years to apprentice to even be a basic watch, a watchmaker in Japan. As we started to move things back to Mexico, we started to learn that became an issue. And again, moving the top level assembly is one thing, but the second and third tier suppliers are significant. Now that we've outsourced for many years to China, many of our companies that purchase from a Flex or a Foxconn, the second and third tier suppliers, the products, the drawings, the toolings, the manufacturing processes and test specs, these things may not be known as well by the companies today in the US, and they create significant barriers for our ability to pick up a supply chain and move that to another region. And one thing that Dr. Shaw and I often talk about is about culture. We don't research that enough in the supply chain, but the cultural shift of a supply chain requires a different strategy and process changes. Not everything will ever work to a China speed. I remember from my home in Shanghai, I travel on a business trip to the US or Europe for 2 to 3 weeks. I come back and all of a sudden a 100-story building is right across the street that wasn't there before I left. The speed of China is incredible. Our ability to move that supply chain will not often have China speed. The way we organize our process for assembly or for manufacturing doesn't necessarily have the Confucian social culture that allows for 20,000 people to work on one specific process 12 hours a day and nothing else but that continuously. So the cultural shift is very important to evaluate, and that's what we learned pre-COVID. And one of the lessons we do learn from picking up supply chains, moving them, is you need to pull your supply chain to a new geography. When I say pull, it means the target geography needs to be most active in going and taking the supply chain, moving it over, rather than a push from your China supply chain to another country. This is all natural because who wants to enable a loss of business? And putting in cost, time, energy, talent into moving a supply chain that only means loss of revenue is very, very difficult. So pulling the supply chain to new geography was a key learning for us. And then COVID hit. And today we see still the every day there are news, there are articles, there are discussion, we are researching shortages and delays. We look at that because those impact our daily lives and our industries, but those are the least of your worries. If we look at right now, our China supply chain, most companies have not been able to visit their supply chain or audit their China suppliers in over 2 years. So that is significant in wondering, is my supply chain still working? Are my sustainability initiatives, are they still in place throughout the supply chain? COVID zero tolerance, lockdown, structural labor shifts had so much to do with how we're operating within the supply chain. And when I say the structural labor shift, there's again coinciding forces that are converging that also create problems for us during COVID. And that is, even with the increased wages, workers, many of which are single children, feeling social and family expectations, buying expensive condos and cars, getting married, having a baby, preparing for a future of expensive education for their children, have been overwhelmed with this massive growth of China. So many social trends like pumping, which is buying flat, has caused a lot of people not to want to go back to the cities with the traditional massive supply chains and in the Pearl River Delta or the Yangtze River Delta. Their parents don't want them to go back due to risks with COVID and many challenges around that come with moving around China today. Another aspect that since COVID, and something for us to look at, is the contract T's and C's that we had in place that were maybe negotiated over many months, years ago. The approved vendor lists, quality and test specs have all been thrown out the door to focus on getting enough delivery of product. So many of those things, even today, those T's and C's will need to be looked at, even going back to your China supply chain. But this is a significant change from impact from COVID. And a key area also is that second and third tier suppliers. I can't mention that enough because many of them have been unable to reopen or have reduced capacity or had trouble shifting between different demand streams of their products. And if you go to China today, what do you really know about your actual supply chain? if you have a top level assembly coming from one of those regions, many of those companies doing that had to go out and find sourcing, find alternative suppliers. Were those necessarily approved? Do they have the quality processes that you're looking for? Do they have the test specs? Do they have the tooling that you need in order to build stamped metal parts, plastics injection molding, toothpaste tube caps? And of course, get ready for the bullwhip effect. As many companies are now going out to double order, triple order to try to get semiconductors, rubber gaskets, tooling. There are so many orders out in the supply chain with all of the shortages and everyone wanting to maintain capacity, maintain shipment, create revenue in our global supply chains, will create at some point in the future. And given the lockdown in Shanghai, before that happened, I would have said maybe a year from now, but we're looking at that significantly as being in effect. And this will affect most of us working in the supply chain over the next 12 to 18 months, for instance. So we see a lot of models and we hear a lot of people talking about our need to reshore and nearshore. Recently, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink put out a letter to investors calling the end of globalization. And companies are all trying to look at how do I model how to regionalize my supply chain, how to mitigate my China risk for geopolitics or for supply chain security and self-sufficiency. One such model was provided by PwC. This is in 2020. So this is right at the beginning of COVID when the conversation was still happening. And this analysis looked at what percentage of products could capture savings if they were nearshored or reshored in the US or in Mexico. And so they looked at, this model looks at labor content as a percentage of total COGS versus a product value density or the percentage of logistics in the total cost of this. And I broke this into 4 different quadrants, looking at what would those products look like. You see on the left side of that, where you have the US at 2% of those products could capture cost savings and Mexico 18% of that. These are the kinds of products that we've seen already. Mexico's bringing in things like medical devices, machinery and automotive, where we have very high percentage of COGS, as well as very high logistics costs as a total cost of the product. These are many of these products we've seen, the responsive supply chains, those with low economies of scale in manufacturing and logistics. If we look at the right side of this chart, the right 2 quadrants, these are the areas of classic China manufacturing, the low demand uncertainty, high economies of scale in both manufacturing and logistics. And this is a lot of our imported product to the United States. This is the apparel, mobile phones, computer accessories that we have that have low logistics costs as with high economies of scale and either low or some high percentage of COGS, percentage of labor in COGS. So this is the challenging part of the supply chain, as it is the lion's share of what we're manufacturing today in China. But what aren't these analyses telling you? We see these analyses everywhere. And so for those of you in companies that are considering, okay, I want to reshore, nearshore, I've built my model, I understand what I need to do. Now, how are you going to make it happen? And so in this, I bring 4 points to you. So first is map your China supply chain now, well in advance that you want to do. Again, that second and third tier are very important to truly understand. What equipment, what testing equipment, what tooling do you have in those second or third tier suppliers? Do you have product specifications at these? Mapping your supply chain is a critical piece of even thinking about moving most of the supply chain, even for instance, in Vietnam or the China +1 model, where you have to export those components to Vietnam, changing from a build-only ecosystem that we have in the China integrated supply chain regions to an export model for components is a very different task than than what we currently have. Now, Brazil has used this model for many years for computers, for high-tech devices, have required manufacturing and the importation of materials so that they build the product for local. They build it in Brazil for Brazil consumption. So mapping your supply chain. Also nurture your existing China supplier relationships. If you are thinking about reshoring, nearshoring, China plus one, the importance of your China suppliers is very important to help you move that product. Trying to get information, making sure you have documentation on your product, your processes. You may have done many improvement projects, implemented lean manufacturing in some of these suppliers. So really understand your gap assessment. And again, you're modeling your new supply chain. And this is a time to think about what are your trade-offs going to be, because they will change when you're thinking about moving. The data and technology strategy becomes very important now as companies start looking at implementing control towers with different layers of data applications, of data optimization, of data infrastructure and applications they're using. Think about your capital investments. This becomes critically important. Modeling your operating cost structure and your financial outcomes. These become very important in how we're modeling the supply chain. And developing partners and suppliers has to happen very early as well. Planning execution, capacity and competencies with the partners and suppliers. Here in the United States and Mexico, we would be at a dearth to have the kinds of tooling capacity today that would be able to do at very fast speed to be able to create the kind of tooling at an effective cost that could move very quickly. So what I like to do with partners and suppliers is what I call war room data integration, BOMs, processes, the contract T's and C's, the tooling, NREs, the non-recurring expenses. These become very important in developing your new partners. It's not, these partners aren't waiting there at the scale you need them to. You will need to war room and prepare and develop those partners and suppliers. And of course, if you're using partners that have experience doing this kind of a pull from a China supply chain into the region, becomes much greater in your risk mitigation than trying to do everything yourself. And last but not least is reinventing your talent strategy. Aligning and scaling talent needs a completely, to a new supply chain strategy is very different. Your existing team and organizational structure may need to change. You may need to hire more data savvy talent. We're seeing this as supply chain educators. We see this consistently with the high demand of supply chain and data analytics talent that are leaving. Companies need more than just buyers and planners. So the point is on the planning. Failure to plan is planning to fail. This is the time to improve your processes, your data infrastructure, cost structure, talent, cash flow, your contracts, lead times, automation. This is where you model your resilience and flexibility, where you're planning for this. What they don't tell you is how to execute. We see any number of models where your CEO and CFO will look at those models and say, see, the manufacturing cost in Mexico is 25% less than it is in China. Let's just go ahead and move it. It makes sense, but that's not the key. The key is how are we going to plan? And now, how are we going to execute and plan for a whole lot more than you expect? So first, build your execution team. There's different competencies than functional management typically within a company. You may not be prepared to have your existing team be that execution team. And think about contract manufacturing. One of the reasons and one of the core reasons of moving manufacturing from the United States to China was to convert our fixed costs into variable costs so that we could show higher gross margins and therefore drive stock prices higher. But that requires moving some of that fixed cost is eliminating a lot of the execution talent you would have normally needed for this. So get that execution team together. I can't emphasize that enough, and get them on the ground in China and documenting complete documentations of first, second, and third tier processes, tooling. What do you think is at those suppliers? What are the processes that are there? Don't forget the open materials orders and the liabilities that may occur if you are moving, say, from a supplier, a complete supplier to a new geography. Execution, again, detailed decision trees and project plans. Decision trees is a tool that I use because it creates quick action and pivots that are needed to manage risk. Everything will change from your plan. And different points in your plan, you will need to have not just a one plan B for your execution, but several plan Bs for your key drivers of your time, your cost, and your resources that you're going to use. And prepare your CFO with risk managed project plans, because there is going to be a lot more inventory, for instance, on your books. And think about that resilience analysis in your detailed plans of doing. Even you think it is successful, it is within your time frame, you still want to build in that resilience analytics into that supply chain. And again, that's at the planning stage, but make sure that's happening during your execution phase. And build your China supply chain buffers early. This is going to be a challenge because building ahead as much as 6 months of finished goods and many key components at your second and third tier suppliers may not be so easy. You may not be communicating right up front what you're trying to do with your demand. And so you're having to build up that inventories well in advance of a transfer, because in those transfers, driving efficiency in that new geography, another thing that we had learned from transfers to Mexico, takes a lot longer than it would have in China. It's just not at China speed. So you will need time to have that finished goods and those strategic components available to maintain your production forecasts and your deliveries. And again, just be fearless. You've analyzed, planned, you've communicated, you're ready to roll. Just do that. Failure is not an option. And I will give some advice from doing this quite so many times, is be gracious with your existing China suppliers and break bread together often. The relationships are all more important in China than the transaction, but don't confuse the hospitality you have with a shared desire for your success. No one wants to lose revenue. No one wants to be building inventory of high quality only to lose revenue later. China has not experienced this. Most of the suppliers over the last 20 years only know growth, continued high growth. They don't know what losing business looks like until COVID hit, and many of our second, third tier suppliers have not reopened or may never reopen. So, and also be demanding in what you're trying to do, and drill down, verify all claims. And another piece of advice, say no first to any request for time, compensation, surprise liabilities that were not planned for, were not known, and all of a sudden there are open purchase orders, which a supplier might want you to compensate them for right away. Your CFO needs to probably model all of those kind of liabilities and put buffers together in those. So my advice, and sometimes people get me on this, is be unreasonable in your expectations. You have to be thorough. You have to drive speed that may not be quite as natural to, for instance, a Mexico or a US that it is in a China. And your flexibility, being able to maneuver, take your plan Bs from your decision tree when needed, and move quickly and be very thorough in your execution. So, are you ready? And I will pause here for 5 seconds. Some people attending, some of the participants may want to take a selfie with the next slide. So you can prepare now for that next slide. So thank you all for allowing me to spend some time with you talking about, can we bring back manufacturing to China? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins. As usual, very good information, very well structured. I open the webinar to questions. So unless we see a rush, I'm just going to let you guys unmute yourself and start with your questionings. While you are questioning, I will also post the feedback form for this session in the chat window. So as soon as you guys receive that, please give us your feedback for the session, what you felt, what you think we could improve. And yeah, please, your questions.
Alfredo, any questions from you? Comments, maybe?
Alfredo is muted.
So let me ask you, Greg, on what you have presented. We're talking about nearshoring, reshoring, but this is also an opportunity to simplify the supply chains because today's supply chains have become very complex, network supply chains.
No, you are absolutely right. And the best opportunity for improving processes, improving efficiency, and really changing our trade-offs is during these times of moving manufacturing. You can guarantee that Apple, for instance, moving their manufacturing, not moving, but adding manufacturing of iPhone into India, I'm sure you would see improved efficiencies, maybe improved automation, maybe improved data structures to help simplify and drive high. The volumes are so high, driving volume at a simplified way. You're very right, Professor.
And I believe there's a request from someone wanting to go back to the last slide super fast.
Go back to the last slide. Yes.
Andrew
Yes.
Bostwick requested.
Okay, yes. Let me pull this up for them.
I think he may be meaning the previous one.
I don't know.
The previous one?
Okay, I haven't heard from.
Hello, this is Dennis Wallowicki. How are you?
Hello, Dennis. Nice to meet you.
Same here. That was a great presentation. I have a question about net zero carbon sustainability. So, of course, if you can move that manufacturing and that product pipeline closer to the US, you'd have less transport and logistics footprint for certain. Has there been any conversation around moving away from China because of dirty manufacturing footprint and environmental conditions in China? And any discussion to claim credit against net zero as a result of a product move?
Boy, Dennis, that is a wonderful question. And you are absolutely right. There is a desire. There's still, in that second, third, you go upstream to the supply chain. Most of those upstream third tier suppliers are entrepreneurs who have built their businesses on their bootstraps with a primary school education in conditions that are hard for workers and are difficult for the companies and the brand owners to really understand what the environmental conditions are in those locations. And we found that with sustainability initiatives with companies struggling with how do they work through that upstream supply chain. You can walk through a Foxconn factory, a Flex factory, and they are clean. They are world-class in their manufacturing and their efficiency. But you start going to that second tier, which is also very good, implemented lean many years ago, are very fine operations, good labor and environmental conditions. But there are issues when you go further upstream, wastewater issues, suppliers that are further out within countryside areas providing product. And again, that I think is your carbon footprint is again a key piece of an advantage of doing things like regionalizing a supply chain and moving away from just one large high economies of scale that may have a very high environmental impact.
Thank you. We have two questions, if you can see the chat. So the question is the bullwhip effect with China's continuous lockdown due to COVID. Do you see concern with industry partners about seeing an endless wave of supply dysfunction?
Yeah, I think this is clogging things up with as we're seeing, we've had shutdowns, some shutdowns we all know from Tesla, the automotive manufacturers, but there is going to be quite a bit dysfunction. Again, remember, demand patterns during COVID had changed drastically as we moved from work from home, where those semiconductors, the automotive companies in spring of 2020, for instance, they reduced their forecast for semiconductors, and all of a sudden semiconductor demand for computers and for work at home equipment shot through the roof. And so that filled up the capacity for those tiered suppliers. But then and then automotive all of a sudden coming back, not able to get supply. So this ripples throughout a lot of our supply chains where there is they've had to change tooling, perhaps. They've had to try to move to different facilities. They've tried to change their raw materials supply chains. So the disruption in creating that this has created will have ripple effects, as well as, don't forget, those contract T's and C's, which have been thrown out the door with the disruption. Getting back to terms and getting back to stability in the supply chain will probably take years from what I see in the supply chain.
Thank you. One more question we have. Do you think reshoring activities have accelerated over the past 10-ish years due to aggressive tariffs and political pressure, and that COVID simply acted as a catalyst?
Excellent, absolutely. I mean, over the last 5 years and the tariffs and really our change in how we relate to a China supply chain has caused difficulties, absolutely. And COVID did exacerbate those problems. Tariffs have been an issue, and they're still going to be an issue. And they take a large portion of the modeling when you're modeling the cost of what a new supply chain structure, supply chain strategy is. Those tariffs will be significant in that model.
Related to this, how do businesses get these cost data? I mean, a lot of this data would not be easily available, right? And I very easily see wrong information on the China cost versus Mexico cost or Peru cost. Is there any advice on how businesses should seek that data?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You see a lot of different data that is built up by consulting companies like a PwC, like a KPMG. Many of these are done through surveys of executives. I know the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai they do surveying of executives of American businesses currently in China. There's many different sources and data and a lot of survey data. And I would take those with a grain of salt. But one thing's clear, the differential between Mexico and China now is very real. As that data showed from 2020, and PwC was looking at 23% reduction in labor cost. But what the companies are struggling with is, yes, that labor cost is good. The CFO saw that, the CEO, they want to move, but getting up to the efficiency level and the productivity level at scale in these geographies takes many years to build up.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question on the punitive action that Chinese government we hear about in press is taking against certain businesses. How does that affect the supply chains?
Absolutely. Industrial policy over while we've been struggling for supply, industrial policy and social policy in China has changed significantly. Everything from data laws. If you were a Tesla now, before you wanted to link your SAP or your ERP data in with your China operations and pull all that data into a control tower, but now with the data security laws that have some vagaries in them around how much data can leave the country, what data can leave the country. The industrial policy changes have a massive impact on how companies will operate in the future in China. And I think this has forever changed in recent years. It's forever changed the nature of how we think about how we work with our Chinese supply base. and the punitive damages do hurt.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question that moving from China to any other Asian country, does it require government-to-government relationships? And how is it's the relation between US and the new country where the supply chain is moved? And how is
there's always
Vietnam?
there's always an influence of that. But Asian-based economies that do have manufacturing that want to draw more employment and more high-paying jobs within their geographies, they've done quite well, and they're very aggressive in lobbying companies. If you think about HP printers, this is a product that Alfredo Veloso and I know very well. When those were built in Vancouver, Washington, and in San Diego, labor arbitrage, then moved that over to Mexico. And then the Singapore government came to HP and came to the United States, making a pitch for tax incentives and for waiving of duties for imports of materials. They become aggressive industrial policies that encourage the pull of that supply chain into those countries. So the country-to-country relations are important, but there are eager industrial bases that want to develop outside of China. China's growth has created envy throughout Asia in terms of what it's been able to do with the development of those countries.
Thank you. Oh, interesting question on the rare earths. China has supposedly the highest access to those rare earth metals. So how would that play in the supply chain movement?
Outstanding question. And I spend a good amount of time studying that EV supply chain. When I look at those forecasts that 50% of world manufactured cars in say 2035 or 2040 will be EVs. Really? Is the supply base upstream of the electric vehicle, the batteries, the rare earths that are required for the magnets, for instance, the praseodymium, the neodymium, those aren't manufactured, and they're ugly to manufacture. They have huge environmental consequences, and that's why you see where those locations are for the mining of the rare earths are in far off locations that are out of sight and out of mind. The working conditions, pollution of groundwater are significant in this mining and the processing of those materials. That will create very much challenges unless industrial policy in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere changes to allow the development of those kinds of materials, the cobalts, the lithiums.
And there's a pollution angle to those materials also, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the pollution of groundwater, pollution of air, carbon emissions. Those are very carbon negative type of negative in a bad way. The effect of carbon on the raw materials, we only look at how EVs as a finished product affects our carbon footprint. But are we looking at what is the effect of carbon of the mining of the materials needed for those batteries? And I see that supply chain developing. Many of the students who are perhaps on this, on this webinar, they might be the ones who are innovating the supply chain of EV to move away from very negative type of mining products that go into those vehicles.
Okay.
Good question.
So a question that China also has a Made in China 2025 policy for high-tech manufacturing. And US has a similar policy. So how would that work out? Or could the US nearshoring be a response to that initiative?
As soon as that came out, the China Made in China 2025 was a part of that wake-up call about China wanting to say we're going to dominate in artificial intelligence, in the highest technologies, moving away from strictly labor-based or worker-based processes into higher tech product. That becomes that's a wake-up call for industrial policy of what does that really mean when we have so much of our supply chain focused in one country that we are always driving for cost.
So I have a question, but I'll extend that. Beyond China, Mexico, how would you rank the other options?
That's interesting. Again, ranking options are difficult because of the populations of countries. And that's one aspect we don't talk about a lot in the supply chain. If you went to Vietnam today, you see how overwhelmed Vietnam seems because of so much manufacturing that's moved there. The port capacity issues that you have. There's only a limited amount of working age population in a lot of those countries. How much scale and scope can they really develop quickly? The ones in Asia that have done very well, Cambodia is small, but Cambodia is seeing a fair share of its growth. Thailand has seen much of its growth. And India has always been the promise with an English-speaking population, well-educated, high-tech personnel and well-trained people has always been, why can't India have the same kind of high volume manufacturing? Can't India absorb some of that scope or scale? And maybe we're starting to see this, but the promise so far has not come to fruition yet.
Thank you. Continuing with the questions, I think we have about 8 minutes, so we will. There is a question. What are the frameworks? What are the frameworks that are available for supply chain management tools, models to assess specific trade-offs which you would recommend?
There are many. There are many, and there are many groups that specialize in this. One of my industry colleagues who runs reshoring.com has a total cost of ownership model. Most of the consulting firms working with this have put together different kinds of models. Like you see the PwC model there. KPMG has good models, and many homegrown models that companies want to keep as part of their trade secret and part of their own modeling. Many of those do need to be customized per industry and for companies. But take a look at that total cost of ownership model, and take a look at the PwC model, and there's plenty of those now somewhat available. But detailed, no one wants to give you a detailed model. Of course, those are costly. So they want to do that. But many companies with the resources, the large multi-billion-dollar companies, they're building their own models with their own internal folks.
Alfredo, you would like to share something, your experience. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Sure. No, I was just, Greg was going through all the slides. It's just brought me back in time. It's I think it's given a lot of details that actually happens on the ground when you move business to other areas, to other factories and to other regions, right? So facts like documentation. Documentation can pull back your schedule significantly, for example. And Greg spoke about that in detail. You go through this, you work with tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. Many of them, you have your documentation, but they might not have, they would do a lot of improvements along the way, and that may not be updated to the documentations that you have. So all this becomes apparent when you start to move the business, and that creates a lot of issue, right? So the level of detail that Greg has provided, the framework, the slides basically becomes a framework, a real model of how to successfully move the business. So I'd like to get a copy of that, Greg.
Absolutely, of course.
And we will host this presentation or the webinar on YouTube. I will send a link to all of you. Before I go to the next question, quickly, just a note, I have sent on the chat window a link for our supply chain center. So if you want to join the center and stay informed, Center for Supply Chain Excellence on LinkedIn, please do that. You would, we post articles on current events on supply chain, and we don't send anybody any emails. So that's one thing we do. Okay, I have a question that Sebastian, he says, my home country, Germany, is heavily investing, automating similar trajectory as Japan, reducing the need for overall labor. Is that an option? Automation?
Oh, absolutely. And that I think is going to be a function of any move to, again, that scale and scope of China. If anyone has not visited China and you're using iPhones and everything in your garage and your home, if you haven't been to China to see that scale, there isn't the populations to move that product, to manufacture that in most countries. So automating is going to be a key, but again, that's sophisticated and takes time. And you need trained people of automation. You need to develop automation engineers in places around the world that today don't have university programs, or as you mentioned, Germany. Germany has a fantastic industrial apprenticeship programs and training programs for, I think it's as many as 60 or 70% of high school graduates go into the trade apprenticeship programs, which are phenomenal in Germany. And I think Germany was likely to be one of those countries that can successfully do this along with Japan. But most other countries will, including the United States, will struggle to build that infrastructure needed in time for any kind of further disruption to the supply chain or permanent disruption to the supply chain via geopolitics or other issues.
Yeah, thank you. So one more question is, I'm just going to read it because it's a long question. If I'm interpreting slide 7 correctly, medical devices would be included in the list of products that may align with reshoring or nearshoring strategies. China industrial policy impacting medtech includes VBP, requiring MNCs to bid for market share. Paralleling Pete's question about risk management tools model to assess trade-off, could the decision to reshore hurt a company's potential to win a VBP bid for maintaining MNC market share in China?
Well, that's an excellent question. Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are a lot. This is the kind of thing you don't plan for, or if you don't plan well enough for, this will derail plans that you're putting in place in your development of execution of a project. And maybe it does. It's possible. Maintaining those, again, nurture that supply chain in China. We tend to think when you're moving away from a supplier, it only happens when you have a bad relationship, when the supplier performed poorly, quality has gone downhill, costs have gotten too high. We tend to just want to move away, turn our back on that supplier. But it takes many years to move a full supply chain, and nurturing those relationships that you have in China, both with local governments. And a lot of my work early on in those years were doing things like, attending high-level political meetings, or I was in the Great Hall of the People talking about outsourcing in China with the president of China, Hu Jintao. It goes that far sometimes for the need to have political involvement in manufacturing in China. So don't run away too fast from China industrial relationships and government relationships, as well as for tax purposes and your ability to get your cash out of China, which is not always easy.
Thank you. We have already exceeded our...
Correct. There is, Spencer had a comment. He would like to jump in with a question. Spencer? We may have lost Spencer.
Is there enough time, Dr. Shah?
I want to end, but Spencer, if you're on a question, quickly, we'll finish your and then end it. We're supposed to end at 2. You can type it.
He's trying to get his mic fixed.
Well, maybe Dr. Shah, I can follow up with Spencer.
Separately.
I do. Yeah, I can follow up with him.
We can do that. Spencer, you can post the question to us and I'll forward it, or the email was there. You can reach out to Professor Collins directly. Thank you, everyone. This was a very engaging session. We will continue to host such sessions every second Wednesday. And just quick inform next, I think it is 8th of April or 11th, I'm not sure, second Wednesday of May, we have a session on driving a vision-driven logistics company. Most of logistics is about firefighting. We have Allen Logistics in our area, which is very different. how do you design a vision-driven logistics company? So that's the topic of our next presentation. You will get the registration link in your emails. Thank you everybody for your time. Thank you a lot, Professor Collins, for creating this presentation, especially for us. Appreciate this. And I hope to continue our discussions.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.